Wind howled like a wounded animal against the frost-choked glass of Oak Ridge's most expensive homes. Inside those multi-million-dollar cabins, wealthy families huddled in designer parkas, watching their breath turn to ice in their living rooms as the power grid failed completely. For months, they had laughed when an older widow spent her summer shoveling dirt, burying half her home underground like a paranoid badger. They called her muddy excavation, an eyesore, and a joke. But as the deadliest blizzard of the decade buried the mountain town, silencing the mocked and the mockers alike, only one chimney plumed with the steady, life-saving smoke of perfectly dry, earth-sheltered firewood. Grief does strange things to the human mind, but for 60-year-old Emily Miller, grief manifested as an unrelenting need to dig. 2 years had passed since her husband, Arthur, suffered a fatal heart attack while clearing snow from the roof of their modest 1970s A-frame cabin in the foothills of the San Juan Mountains in Colorado. Since that day, the cabin had felt too large, the whistling wind too loud, and the winters entirely too menacing. Arthur had been the one to chop the wood, stack it neatly against the siding, and keep the hearth roaring when the mercury plummeted below zero. Without him, Emily was left to face the brutal alpine elements alone. Oak Ridge was a town deeply divided by altitude and attitude. In the valley sat the older, weather-beaten homes of the locals' miners, loggers, and retirees like Emily. But slowly creeping up the mountainside was a new development of ultra-modern, glass-fronted chalets owned by out-of-state millionaires who treated the rugged landscape as a picturesque backdrop for their holiday parties. Among these new neighbors were Bill and Kathy Chambers, a couple in their early 40s from California who had built a spectacular, jutting masterpiece of steel and floor-to-ceiling windows just a quarter-mile up the road from Emily's A-frame. It began in late April, just as the final thaw turned the ground from impenetrable granite to heavy, pliable mud. Emily did not hire an excavation crew. She didn't want the noise, and she certainly didn't want the questions. Instead, she purchased a heavy-duty wheelbarrow, a forged steel pickaxe, a square-nosed spade, and a pair of reinforced leatherwork gloves. Her plan was unorthodox, born from an old pioneer journal she had found in the county archives. She was going to dig a subterranean dugout, an earth-sheltered extension, directly beneath the overhanging front deck of her cabin. It wouldn't just be a root cellar. It would be a fortified, climate-controlled bunker, specifically designed to hold 5 cords of firewood, a secondary cast-iron stove, and months of preserved food. By sinking the room below the frost line, the earth itself would act as an insulator, keeping the ambient temperature a steady 50 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of the raging blizzards above. More importantly, it would keep her firewood bone dry, protected from the horizontal snowdrifts that routinely soaked the exterior woodpiles of Oak Ridge. The physical labor was agonizing. On the first day, Emily managed to carve out a trench barely 2 feet deep and 4 feet wide. Her shoulders screamed in protest, and blisters formed beneath her gloves, popping and stinging with sweat. The soil was a stubborn mix of clay and river rock, requiring her to swing the pickaxe with all her remaining upper body strength just to loosen a few shovelfuls. But with every rock she unearthed and every wheelbarrow she dumped in the backwoods, the heavy, suffocating weight of Arthur's absence felt just a fraction lighter. She found a rhythmic meditation in the dirt. By the 3rd week of May, the hole had expanded into a gaping crater, 10 feet wide, 15 feet long, and 6 feet deep, extending partially beneath the foundation of the cabin itself, supported by heavy wooden shoring jacks she had meticulously installed to prevent a collapse. It was during one of her midday breaks, as she sat on an overturned bucket wiping dirt from her brow, that the first visitor arrived. A pristine silver Range Rover crunched to a halt on the gravel road bordering her property. The driver's side door opened, and Bill Chambers stepped out, wearing spotless tan slacks and a designer fleece vest. He walked to the property line, peering over the split-rail fence with an expression caught between amusement and concern. "Morning, Emily," Bill called out, his voice carrying the booming, unearned confidence of a man used to directing boardrooms. Emily stood up, brushing clay from her heavy denim overalls. "Morning, Bill. What can I do for you?" Bill leaned against the fence, his eyes scanning the massive pile of excavated dirt and the deep, shadowed pit beneath her deck. "I was just driving into town and saw the construction zone. Or, well, destruction zone, I suppose. What on earth are you doing down there? Trying to strike gold? Emily adjusted her work gloves. She had anticipated the questions, but the sheer condescension in his tone irritated her. I'm building a dugout. An earth-sheltered cellar for wood storage and winter supplies. Bill chuckled, a sharp, dismissive sound. A dugout? Like a hobbit hole? Emily, it's the 21st century. If you need extra storage, you can just buy a prefab shed from the hardware store. Or if it's about the heating, you should look into what we installed up at our place. Geothermal heat pumps, backed up by a smart grid propane generator. I don't even have to touch a piece of firewood. I just tap a screen on my iPad. That sounds very convenient, Bill, Emily said evenly, picking up her spade. But technology breaks. The earth doesn't. Bill shook his head, looking at her muddy boots, and the sweat-stained brim of her hat, with thinly veiled pity. Well, I hope you know what you're doing. Digging around the foundation like that. It's a good way to collapse your whole house. Plus, to be completely frank, the dirt piles aren't exactly doing wonders for the neighborhood's curb appeal. A few of the folks up the hill were wondering if you were turning the lot into a landfill. Emily's grip tightened on the handle of her shovel. My property line ends at that fence, Bill. What I do on this side of it is my business. The dirt will be used to berm the walls once the timber is in place. It won't be a mess forever. Right. Well, just don't bury yourself alive down there, Emily. Bill laughed, turning back to his luxury SUV. Let me know if you need to borrow a real heater this winter. Emily watched him drive away, the tires of his heavy vehicle kicking up a cloud of white dust. She turned back to her trench. The interaction hadn't discouraged her. If anything, the smug arrogance of the new arrivals only fueled her fire. She raised the pickaxe, brought it down hard into the clay, and kept digging. By mid-July, the summer sun was baking the San Juan Valley, but down in the excavation, the air was cool and damp. Emily's project had evolved from a simple hole in the ground to a complex, engineered structure. She had hired a local supplier to deliver massive, pressure-treated 6x6 timbers and hundreds of heavy-duty polypropylene earth bags. Filling the bags with the excavated soil, Emily painstakingly stacked them to form thick, impenetrable retaining walls, utilizing a technique developed by military engineers and eco-builders. Between the layers of earth bags, she laid strands of barbed wire for tensile strength, locking the heavy walls together. Over the walls, she applied a thick layer of rubberized waterproofing membrane, followed by rigid foam insulation, and finally, a network of perforated PVC pipes for a French drain system that would divert groundwater away from the structure. The physical transformation in Emily was profound. The soft, grieving widow had been replaced by a lean, sun-baked woman with calloused hands and a quiet, unyielding focus. She worked from dawn until dusk, stopping only to drink water or eat a sandwich on her porch. However, as the structure took shape, so did the neighborhood gossip. Oak Ridge was a small town, and the wealthy enclaves above it were even smaller. Emily's dugout became the primary subject of conversation at dinner parties and summer barbecues to which she was never invited. The gossip came to a head on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon at Oak Ridge Hardware and Supply. Emily had driven her battered 1998 Ford Ranger into town to purchase galvanized nails, structural screws, and heavy-duty hinges for the dugout's trapdoor. Gary Higgins, the 65-year-old owner of the hardware store, was bagging her items when the bell above the door chimed. Kathy Chambers walked in, wearing immaculate white tennis clothes, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight, flawless ponytail. She was looking for imported deck oil. Emily. Hi, Kathy said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she approached the counter. I haven't seen you all summer. Bill says you've been working terribly hard in the dirt. I've been keeping busy, Emily replied curtly, handing a $50 bill to Gary. Kathy leaned against the counter, surveying the heavy hardware Emily was purchasing. You know, Emily, a few of us from the Upper Ridge Homeowners Association had a little meeting last week. We were just expressing our concerns. I'm not in the Upper Ridge HOA, Kathy, Emily pointed out, her voice flat. My house was built 30 years before your subdivision existed. I know. Kathy waved a manicured hand dismissively. But we share the same access road. And, well, seeing that massive crater and those piles of black sandbags, It looks like a military bunker, Emily. People are starting to talk. They're saying you're preparing for the end of the world. A doomsday prepper, they called it. Gary Higgins paused his bagging, looking nervously between the two women. I'm preparing for winter, Kathy. Nothing more, Emily said, picking up her heavy brown paper bags. But it's just so unnecessary, Kathy pressed, stepping into Emily's path. Bill and I just had our automatic driveway melters inspected. We have triple-pane glass. The power company upgraded the substations last year. We aren't living in the dark ages anymore, Emily. It breaks my heart to see you out there, breaking your back like a peasant, when you could just upgrade your HVAC system. She lowered her voice, feigning sympathy. Is it a money issue? Because Bill knows a contractor who could probably give you a discount on a decent electric furnace. The sheer audacity of the offer made Emily's jaw tighten. They didn't understand. They thought money and wires could tame the mountains. They had never seen a true Colorado whiteout, the kind that snapped power lines like dry twigs and froze the diesel and snowplow engines. Arthur and Emily had barely survived the blizzard of '98, and that was with a fully stocked indoor woodpile. I have a furnace, Kathy. I also have an understanding of where we live, Emily said, stepping around the younger woman. Nature doesn't care about your smart grid. When the sky turns black, I prefer to rely on things I can touch. She walked out of the store, the chime of the door echoing behind her. By September, the dugout was complete. Emily had framed a heavy, slanted roof over the earthbag walls, tied it directly into the joists of her existing deck, and covered it with thick rubber roofing, followed by 2 feet of topsoil. She seeded the topsoil with native mountain grass. From the street, the massive crater had vanished. The property looked exactly as it had before, except for a heavy, reinforced steel hatch hidden beneath the steps of her porch, and 2 discrete metal ventilation pipes poking out of the grass. Beneath the earth, however, it was a masterpiece of survival. The room was spacious, smelling of damp earth and fresh pine. The walls were plastered smooth. Along the back wall, Emily had stacked 5 full cords of seasoned oak and pine, meticulously split and organized. The wood was completely protected from rain, snow, and the ambient humidity. In the center of the dugout sat a small, highly efficient cast-iron wood stove, properly vented up through the side of the house. Shelves lined the remaining walls, stocked with canned vegetables, heavy woolen blankets, kerosene lanterns, and emergency water. She had built her fortress. Now, she just had to wait for the enemy to arrive. Late November blew into Oak Ridge with a bitter, unnatural silence. The vibrant golds and reds of the autumn aspens had long since been stripped away by freezing evening winds, leaving the mountains looking stark and skeletal. The tourists had gone home, and the wealthy residents of the upper ridge retreated into their heated glass boxes, hosting Thanksgiving dinners illuminated by smart lighting systems and warmed by invisible, silent forced air. Inside the earth-sheltered dugout, Emily Miller was making her final preparations. The temperature outside had hovered around 30 degrees all week, but down in her bunker, the thermometer sat stubbornly at 52 degrees, warmed purely by the insulating mass of the earth. She ran her hand along the perfectly dry bark of an oak log. The wood was practically humming with potential energy. Upstairs, the local news station was playing on her small television. The meteorologist, a usually cheerful man with perfect hair, looked remarkably grim. He stood in front of a sprawling radar map that was entirely engulfed in a violent swirl of purple and crimson. We are issuing a severe historic weather warning for the entire San Juan region, the weatherman said, his voice devoid of its usual broadcast cadence. Meteorologists are calling this the Pine Ridge Anomaly. It is a massive bomb cyclone, rapidly losing barometric pressure, dragging down Arctic air straight from the polar vortex. We are expecting up to 6 feet of snow in the higher elevations, accompanied by sustained winds of 70 miles per hour. This will create zero visibility whiteout conditions. Wind chills could drop to 40 below zero. Do not travel. If you are in an isolated area, prepare for prolonged power outages. May God be with you. Emily turned off the television. She walked to her front window and looked out. The sky was not gray. It was a bruised, sickly purple. The barometric pressure was dropping so fast it made her ears pop. Up the hill, she could see Bill Chambers, standing on his sprawling composite deck. He was wearing a heavy designer coat, holding a pair of binoculars, looking at the approaching storm front. Below his deck, sitting on a poured concrete pad completely exposed to the elements, was his pride and joy, the massive, commercial-grade propane generator he had bragged about all summer. Later that afternoon, the first flakes began to fall. They weren't the fat, lazy snowflakes of a picturesque winter evening. They were tiny, sharp as broken glass, and driven perfectly horizontal by a shrieking wind. Within an hour, the world outside Emily's window simply disappeared. The pine trees vanished. The road vanished. The sky vanished. There was only a deafening, roaring white void. The temperature plummeted with terrifying speed. By 6 p.m., it was -10 degrees. By 8 p.m., it was -25. Inside the modern glass marvels of the upper ridge, the residents watched the storm with a mixture of awe and nervous excitement. Kathy Chambers poured herself a glass of Merlot, standing near her floor-to-ceiling windows, marveling at the sheer violence of the blizzard safely behind 3 panes of tempered glass. Suddenly, the lights flickered. The soft hum of the massive geothermal heat pump hesitated, groaned, and then died. In the valley, a major transmission tower had succumbed to the weight of ice and the sheer force of the wind, collapsing into a ravine and severing the main arterial power feed to the entire county. Oak Ridge plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. "Bill!" Kathy called out, the darkness instantly amplifying the roar of the wind outside. "It's fine. It's fine." Bill yelled back from the kitchen, fumbling for his phone to use as a flashlight. "The grid is down, but the smart generator is programmed to kick in after a 30-second delay. Just wait." They stood in the dark, counting the seconds. 30 seconds passed. A minute passed. 2 minutes. "Bill, why isn't it turning on?" Kathy asked, a thread of genuine panic finally weaving into her voice. "I don't know. The wireless transfer switch must be glitching because the router went down. I'll have to go out and manually override it at the unit." Bill put on his heavy coat, grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight, and opened the side door. The moment the latch released, the wind violently ripped the door from his grasp, slamming it backward against the siding with a crack that shattered the interior drywall. The cold that flooded the kitchen was not just uncomfortable. It was violently, aggressively painful. It felt like walking into liquid nitrogen. Gasping for breath, Bill forced his way out onto the deck and down the stairs to the concrete pad. The snow was already waist-deep and drifting fast. He reached the heavy metal housing of his $20,000 generator and shined the light on the control panel. It was completely encased in 3 inches of solid, impenetrable ice. The horizontal wind had driven freezing rain and snow directly into the louvered vents of the machine, freezing the intake valves solid. The digital touchscreen was dead, frozen beneath a rime of frost. Desperate, Bill grabbed a heavy metal snow shovel and slammed it against the ice encasing the controls. The shovel bounced off, jarring his wrists, barely scratching the surface of the ice block. He tried again, hitting it harder, but the cold was already seeping through his expensive gloves, his fingers going numb. The machine that was supposed to save them was nothing more than a giant frozen paperweight. He abandoned the effort, fighting his way back into the house, requiring both him and Kathy pushing with all their weight just to force the side door shut against the howling gale. "It's frozen," Bill gasped, collapsing onto the hardwood floor, shivering violently. "The intake is choked with ice. It won't start." Kathy looked around the dark, sprawling house. Without the constant feed of the heavy-duty electric furnace, the massive expanse of glass windows was rapidly bleeding out the home's ambient heat. They had no fireplace. Bill had opted out of one, claiming it caused unnecessary soot and ruined the modern aesthetic. Within an hour, their breath was visible in the living room. Within 2 hours, the water in their dog's bowl in the kitchen froze solid. Down the hill, hidden beneath the raging drifts, Emily Miller opened the heavy steel hatch of her dugout. She climbed down the wooden stairs, securing the hatch above her, shutting out the deafening roar of the blizzard. The dugout was deeply quiet. It was dark, save for the warm, golden glow of a kerosene lantern she had lit on a small table. The temperature down here was still 50 degrees. She walked over to her massive, perfectly dry woodpile. She selected several pieces of kindling and a split log of aged oak, arranging them inside the cast-iron stove. She struck a single match. The dry wood caught instantly, the flames crackling to life, casting dancing shadows against the smooth earthen walls. Within minutes, the heavy iron stove began to radiate a fierce, comforting heat. Emily sat in a comfortable armchair she had moved down there weeks ago, pulling a thick wool blanket over her lap. She listened to the muffled, distant howling of the wind above the earth. Safe, warm, and entirely self-reliant. She poured herself a cup of hot tea from a thermos, her eyes reflecting the steady, life-giving fire. The storm raged on into the night, burying Oak Ridge in a historic tomb of white. Up on the hill, the modern glass castles were freezing from the inside out. But deep beneath the snow, the widow's fire burned bright. By the morning of the second day, the Pine Ridge anomaly had transformed from a severe weather event into a localized apocalypse. The wind had not stopped howling for 18 consecutive hours, carrying with it a terrifying, relentless payload of powder that buried the lower levels of the A-frame cabins in the valley. The barometric pressure remained dangerously low, and the ambient air temperature outside sat at an agonizing -34 degrees Fahrenheit. With the wind chill, stepping outside exposed a human being to -60. At that temperature, exposed skin would succumb to frostbite in less than 5 minutes. Up on the upper ridge, the architectural marvels of the wealthy were actively turning against their occupants. The very features that made the Chambers house a stunning summer retreat, the soaring ceilings, the open floor plan, and the massive, uncurtained expanses of triple-pane architectural glass, were now accelerating their demise. Heat rises, and what little ambient warmth was left in the lower levels was quickly sucked up into the 20-foot vaulted ceilings, leaving the living room a bitter, freezing trap. Bill Chambers sat on his imported Italian leather sofa, wrapped in a heavy goose-down comforter, his teeth chattering so violently he thought his jaw might fracture. Beside him, Kathy was a tight, shivering ball beneath 3 wool throws, weeping silently. Her tears felt thick and icy on her cheeks. The absolute darkness of the house was oppressive. Their cell phones had died hours ago. Their batteries drained rapidly by the plummeting indoor temperature, which had just crossed the threshold of 20 degrees and was still falling. "We have to start a fire," Kathy mumbled, her voice muffled by the heavy blankets. "Bill, we're going to freeze to death in here." "Where?" Bill snapped, his voice tight with fear and frustration. "We don't have a chimney, Kath. The architect said a bioethanol feature piece was more eco-friendly. Do you want me to light the dining table on fire in the middle of the living room? We'll die of carbon monoxide poisoning before we thaw out." He was right, and the realization only deepened their despair. The high-tech, eco-friendly smart home was an airtight sealed box. Without the massive ventilation system running to cycle the air, burning anything substantial indoors would quickly fill the tight building envelope with toxic smoke. Their survival relied entirely on an invisible grid of electricity that had been severed by a falling pine tree 10 miles down the mountain. Across the street, their neighbor, a corporate litigator named Richard Davies, was faring even worse. Richard had scoffed at the storm warnings, assuming his heavy-duty luxury SUV, equipped with snow tires and all-wheel drive, could easily navigate a few inches of powder if things got rough. At 3 a.m., in a panic over the freezing temperatures in his own glass-fronted chalet, Richard had loaded his wife Patricia into the vehicle and hit the garage door opener. When the electronic opener failed due to the blackout, he manually decoupled the door and lifted it, only to be met with a solid 5-foot wall of compacted snowdrift that had entirely sealed his driveway. He had tried to ram the SUV through it, high-centering the heavy vehicle on a massive block of ice hidden in the drift, destroying the undercarriage and leaving the car hopelessly stuck and exposed to the elements. They had been forced to crawl back into their freezing house, defeated and trapped. The reality of the mountain was asserting itself. Money, status, and smart technology were entirely irrelevant in the face of a true alpine whiteout. Down in the valley, buried beneath 4 feet of snow, Emily Miller's earth-sheltered dugout was a sanctuary of profound quiet. The heavy steel hatch and the 2 feet of topsoil above her head absorbed the deafening roar of the blizzard, reducing the 70-mile-per-hour winds to a distant, muffled vibration. The temperature inside the dugout remained a steady, comforting 65 degrees, bolstered by the small cast-iron wood stove radiating dry, consistent heat. Emily sat in the warm glow of a kerosene lamp, her hands wrapped around a tin mug of percolated coffee. She had spent the morning calmly splitting smaller kindling from a large oak log, the sharp thwack of her hatchet echoing off the smooth, plastered earthbag walls. The air smelled of wood smoke, roasted coffee beans, and the faint, grounding scent of dry clay. Her firewood was pristine. Unlike the exterior cords of wood typical to the region, which were currently encased in inches of solid ice and utterly useless to anyone trying to start a fire, her logs were bone dry, protected by the heavy rubber membrane and the deep earth surrounding her bunker. The moisture content of the oak was perfect. It caught a spark instantly and burned with a slow, furious intensity. She walked over to the 2 PVC ventilation pipes extending from the ceiling. This was the only vulnerable part of her design. If the snow piled high enough to cover the exterior vents, the wood stove would consume all the oxygen in the small room, suffocating her. But Emily had prepared for this. Using a long, custom-measured rod of rebar she kept beside the pipes, she pushed it up through the intake vent, feeling resistance as it met the compacted snow above. With a few sharp thrusts, she broke through the ice crust at the surface, clearing the airway. A sharp blast of Arctic air whistled down the pipe, feeding the stove and ensuring the air in the bunker remained fresh. She turned on her small, battery-operated weather radio. The automated voice of the National Weather Service looped in a static-filled, monotonous drone. Blizzard warning remains in effect. Travel is impossible. Emergency services are suspended until conditions improve. Residents are advised to shelter in place and conserve body heat. Expected duration of the storm system is an additional 48 hours. 48 more hours. Emily looked at her stockpiled food and the towering wall of dry wood. She could survive down here for 48 days if she had to. But as she took a sip of her coffee, a heavy, unsettling thought crept into her mind. She thought of Bill Chambers' smug face. She thought of Kathy's manicured hands. She knew the architecture of those modern homes up the ridge. They were built for views, not for survival. They were going to freeze to death. By the afternoon of the second day, the situation inside the Chambers residence had shifted from miserable to lethal. The ambient temperature in their living room had dropped to 8 degrees Fahrenheit. The frost inside the windows was no longer a thin film. It was a thick, opaque sheet of ice that obscured the raging whiteout outside. Then came the sound that every homeowner in a freezing climate dreads, a sharp, explosive crack echoing from the kitchen, followed immediately by the violent hiss of high-pressure water. "No, no, no!" Bill shouted, throwing off his blankets and stumbling toward the kitchen, his limbs stiff and uncoordinated from the deep cold. The primary water line beneath the large, imported marble island had frozen solid. The expanding ice had shattered the copper pipe, and as a pocket of pressure released, it sent a geyser of freezing water spraying across the hardwood floors. Because the power was out, the electronic shutoff valves of their smart plumbing system were completely unresponsive. The water pooled rapidly, soaking the expensive rugs and beginning to freeze almost immediately upon contact with the frigid air, turning the kitchen floor into a hazardous skating rink. Bill frantically searched for the manual shutoff in the dark, his bare hands slipping on the icy metal valves beneath the sink. By the time he finally managed to crank the main line closed, his hands were wet, red, and screaming with pain. He collapsed against the cabinets, his breath pluming in thick white clouds, staring at the destruction of his multi-million-dollar kitchen. When he returned to the living room, Kathy was dangerously quiet. She had stopped shivering. Bill knew enough from his expensive weekend ski trips to recognize the early stages of severe hypothermia. When the body stops shivering, it means the core temperature has dropped so low that the muscles no longer have the energy to generate heat. A profound lethargy was taking over her mind. "Kathy," Bill said, his voice cracking, shaking her shoulder. "Kath, wake up, look at me." She blinked slowly, her lips tinged a terrifying shade of blue. "I'm just tired, Billy. I just want to sleep for a few minutes. It's not so cold anymore." Panic, pure and primal, finally shattered the last remnants of Bill's arrogance. His wealth, his status, his automated home, none of it mattered. He was watching his wife slowly die on an Italian leather sofa. He looked around the frozen tomb of his living room. They had exhausted all their options. The car was trapped. The generator was a block of ice. The roads were impassable. There was no rescue coming. His mind raced, desperately searching for a heat source, a fire, anything. And then, through the fog of his own freezing brain, an image surfaced. He remembered standing by the split-rail fence in the heat of July. He remembered looking down into the massive, muddy trench. He remembered the heavy pressure-treated timbers, the thick earth-bag walls, and the black, rubberized membrane. He remembered the wood, cords and cords of firewood, stacked deep underground, safe from the wind, safe from the ice. He remembered Emily Miller. The dugout, Bill whispered, his voice hoarse. Emily's dugout. It was a quarter-mile down the mountain. On a clear summer day, it was a 5-minute stroll down a paved access road. In the middle of a historic bomb cyclone, through chest-high snowdrifts and -60-degree wind chills, it was a death march. But staying in the glass house was a guaranteed death sentence. The choice was between dying in the snow, fighting, or dying quietly on the couch. "Kathy, get up," Bill commanded, his voice finding a new, desperate strength. He hauled her upright, ignoring her weak protests. "We're leaving. We have to go to Emily's." "It's too far," Kathy mumbled, her head lolling against his chest. "I can't walk. You have to. If we stay here, we die." "I am not letting you die in here." He dragged her to the mudroom. Their survival depended entirely on the next 10 minutes. He forced her into her heavy ski bibs, layering her in every fleece jacket and cashmere sweater they owned. He wrapped a thick wool scarf around her face, leaving only a small slit for her eyes, and jammed a heavy beanie over her head. He dressed himself in a similar chaotic layer of high-end outdoor gear, grabbing a pair of ski goggles to protect his eyes from the blinding snow. Before leaving, Bill grabbed a heavy steel fireplace poker from an ornamental stand by the front door, a prop he had bought for aesthetic appeal, having no actual fireplace. He didn't know exactly where Emily's hatch was buried beneath the snow, and he would need something to probe the drifts. He put his arm around Kathy's waist, bracing her against his side. "We're going to walk down the middle of the road. We follow the tree line on the right. Just keep moving your feet, Kath. Do not stop. If we stop, we're done." He reached for the front door handle. The metal was so cold it burned through his insulated gloves. He took a deep breath, braced his shoulder against the heavy mahogany door, and pushed it open into the howling white void. The moment they stepped off the covered porch, the mountains swallowed them whole. The wind hit Bill with the physical force of a moving vehicle, nearly knocking him backward into the doorframe. The roar was absolute, a deafening, chaotic scream that drowned out all thought. The snow was not falling. It was being driven horizontally, violently blasting against their goggles and instantly freezing to their scarves. Bill plunged his leg into the snow. It swallowed him up to his mid-thigh. Every step required him to lift his leg entirely out of the heavy, compacted drift, drive it forward, and drag Kathy along with him. Within 10 paces his lungs were burning, the freezing air searing his throat like inhaled glass. "Keep moving!" he screamed, though he couldn't even hear his own voice over the wind. The world was entirely devoid of landmarks. The sky, the road, and the trees were all erased, replaced by a violent, swirling canvas of white. Bill navigated entirely by memory, and the faint, shadowed outline of the massive pine trees that bordered the right side of the access road. Progress was agonizingly slow. A journey that usually took 5 minutes stretched into 20, then 30. Kathy was dead weight against his side, her feet dragging through the trenches Bill was carving in the snow. She stumbled, pulling them both down into a massive drift. The snow enveloped them, cold and suffocating. Bill fought the urge to just lie there. The snowdrift actually offered a temporary reprieve from the cutting wind. It was quiet down in the powder. The insidious warmth of hypothermia whispered in his mind, telling him to close his eyes just for a second. No. He roared in frustration, fighting his way back to his feet, hauling Kathy up by the collar of her jacket. He shook her violently. "Look at me. Keep your eyes open." They pushed forward. 40 minutes. 50 minutes. Bill's legs felt like they were encased in concrete. His goggles were completely iced over on the outside, forcing him to scrape them blindly with his heavy gloves just to see 2 feet in front of his face. Suddenly, the shadowy outline of the trees broke. They had reached the clearing, Emily's property. Bill stopped, gasping for air, scanning the featureless white landscape. The old A-frame cabin was completely buried up to its second-story windows. The front deck, beneath which the dugout was hidden, was a smooth, uninterrupted mountain of snow. Panic seized his chest. Where was it? The crater had been massive in the summer, but now, beneath 6 feet of drifting snow, the topography of the yard was completely erased. He dropped Kathy safely against the trunk of a massive spruce tree that offered a tiny sliver of windbreak. He took the steel fireplace poker and waded into the deep snow, near where he estimated the front steps of the cabin should be. He began to probe, plunging the steel rod deep into the powder. Soft snow, soft snow, soft snow. He moved a foot to the left. He plunged the rod down. Clang! A faint metallic vibration traveled up the steel rod, ringing through his heavy gloves. He hit something solid, something metal. He fell to his knees, dropping the poker, and began digging with his hands. He tore through the heavy layers of packed snow like a desperate dog, throwing chunks of ice over his shoulder. His gloves were soaked through, his fingers entirely numb, but he didn't stop. 2 feet down, 3 feet down. Finally, his gloves scraped against a flat, freezing surface. The heavy steel handle of the bunker hatch. He cleared the snow away from the edges, his heart pounding in his throat. He grabbed the handle with both hands, planted his boots against the icy rim of the hole he had dug, and pulled with every ounce of strength he had left in his freezing body. It didn't budge. The edges of the hatch had frozen shut, locked by a seal of ice. "Help!" Bill screamed at the snow, tears of absolute despair freezing to his eyelashes. He pounded his fists against the heavy steel plate. "Emily, please, we're out here, please." He pounded again, the dull thuds swallowed entirely by the raging wind. He was out of energy. He had failed. He collapsed over the hatch, laying his face against the freezing steel, a broken, sobbing mess. He closed his eyes, ready to let the cold take him. Beneath the earth, sitting by her glowing wood stove, Emily Miller paused. She lowered her book. Over the low roar of the stove's draft, she had felt a vibration, a rhythmic, heavy thumping, echoing down through the heavy timbers of the ceiling. She stood up, her heart skipping a beat. She walked to the base of the wooden stairs leading up to the hatch. She listened closely. Thump, thump, thump. It was weak, but unmistakable. Someone was up there. Emily didn't hesitate. She grabbed a heavy wooden mallet she kept near the firewood, climbed the wooden steps, and stood beneath the heavy steel door. She unlatched the heavy interior deadbolt. "Stand back," she yelled, though she knew they likely couldn't hear her. She took the heavy mallet and struck the bottom of the steel hatch with a massive, upward swing. The concussive force shattered the ice seal, holding the door shut from the outside. Above ground, Bill felt the steel plate violently jolt beneath his chest. He scrambled backward in the snow, just as the heavy hatch heaved upward, pushed open by a pair of strong, denim-clad arms. A blast of warm, 65-degree air, smelling strongly of dry oak and wood smoke, erupted from the earth like the breath of a dragon, instantly melting the frost on Bill's goggles. Emily Miller stood at the bottom of the stairs, bathed in the golden light of her kerosene lantern, holding the heavy steel door open against the raging wind. She looked up at the shivering, broken millionaire kneeling in the snow. "Get her down here, Bill," Emily shouted over the roar of the blizzard. "Before you let the heat out." Bill scrambled back to the tree, hauling Kathy's limp body through the snow, half carrying, half dragging her to the open hatch. He practically threw them both down the wooden stairs, tumbling into the warm, earthy-smelling room, before Emily slammed the heavy steel hatch shut above them, instantly cutting off the shrieking wind and plunging the room back into a profound, life-saving silence. Bill lay on the dirt floor, staring up at the rough-hewn timbers and the perfectly dry stacks of firewood lining the walls. The heat radiating from the small cast-iron stove felt like a physical embrace. He looked up at Emily, the woman he had mocked all summer, the woman he had called a peasant. You saved us," Bill choked out, his voice cracking as the warmth began to painfully thaw his frozen face. Emily walked over to her stove, picked up a perfectly dry piece of oak, and tossed it into the flames. "I didn't save you, Bill," Emily said quietly, pulling a heavy wool blanket from her shelf and draping it over Kathy's shivering body. "The dirt did. Now, drink some water. It's going to be a long couple of days. The transition from -60 degrees to 65 degrees is not a gentle relief." It is a violent, agonizing, biological shock. As the heavy steel hatch sealed the raging blizzard outside, the profound silence of the dugout was broken only by the crackle of the oak fire and the ragged, desperate wheezing of Bill Chambers. He remained on his hands and knees on the hard-packed dirt floor, his body shaking with violent, uncontrollable tremors. The snow caked to his designer outdoor gear began to melt instantly, pooling into dark, muddy puddles around him. Beside him, Kathy lay frighteningly still beneath the thick wool blanket Emily had thrown over her. The lethal lethargy of severe hypothermia had dragged her deep into unconsciousness. Emily Miller did not panic. Panic was a luxury the mountains did not afford. She moved with the practiced, efficient grace of a woman who had spent decades anticipating disaster. "Get her wet layers off, Bill," Emily commanded, her voice slicing through his daze. She moved to a heavy wooden shelf, pulling down a stack of thick, gray thermal blankets she had purchased from a military surplus catalog in Denver. "If she stays in those wet clothes, her core temperature will keep dropping, even in here. It's called the afterdrop. Do it now." Bill fumbled with his frozen, useless fingers. He couldn't grip the heavy zippers of Kathy's ski bibs. He whimpered in frustration, tearing at the fabric like a helpless child. "I can't," he choked out, tears of pain and humiliation streaming down his face. "My hands, they aren't working." Emily stepped in, gently pushing him aside. She drew a small, sharp utility knife from her pocket and expertly sliced through the heavy nylon of Kathy's outer layers, peeling the soaking wet, freezing garments away from her body. She worked quickly, replacing the wet clothes with dry, coarse wool, wrapping Kathy in a tight cocoon. "Move closer to the stove, but not directly against it," Emily instructed, helping Bill drag his unconscious wife a few feet nearer to the cast-iron belly of the heater. "Too much heat too fast will send her into cardiac arrest. We have to warm the blood slowly." Bill slumped against the smooth earthbag wall, his chest heaving. He finally managed to pull off his own iced-over gloves and hat. His fingers were a waxy, terrifying shade of white, the capillary beds entirely devoid of blood. As the ambient heat of the room began to penetrate his skin, a sensation like 1,000 red-hot needles drove into his extremities. He bit his lip hard enough to draw blood, stifling a scream. Emily walked over to the stove and poured water from a copper kettle into a dented tin mug. She dropped in a cube of beef bouillon and stirred it until it dissolved, the rich, salty smell filling the small bunker. She walked over and knelt beside Bill, holding the mug out. "Drink it slowly," she said, her tone devoid of the resentment he expected. There was no, "I told you so." There was only the grim reality of survival. It will burn going down, but you need the sodium and the heat in your core. Bill took the mug with trembling hands. He brought it to his lips, sipping the scalding broth. It felt like swallowing liquid fire, but as it hit his stomach, a microscopic ember of real warmth finally blossomed in his chest. He looked around the room, really seeing it for the first time. It was a masterpiece of utilitarian engineering. The heavy pressure-treated timbers overhead were solid and unyielding, supporting tons of earth and snow. The walls, plastered over the soil-filled bags, were dry and warm to the touch. And the woodpile, it was magnificent. 5 cords of perfectly split, seasoned oak, stacked with mathematical precision against the back wall, safe from the suffocating ice that had crippled his multi-million-dollar estate. "I thought we were dead," Bill whispered, staring at the flames dancing behind the glass door of the stove. "When the generator froze, we had nothing. The house was just a glass tombe." Emily sat back in her armchair, picking up her own mug of coffee. "Glass doesn't hold heat, Bill. It just looks pretty. You build a house to fight the mountain. The mountain is going to win every time. You have to build with it. The earth is 50 degrees year-round. It doesn't care if it's the 4th of July or a bomb cyclone." Bill looked down at his ruined hands. He thought of his smart home, his automated thermostats, his imported Italian leather. Millions of dollars spent to create an illusion of control. It had taken exactly 36 hours of real weather to reduce him to a begging, freezing animal, entirely dependent on the charity of a woman he had openly mocked. "I'm sorry," Bill said, his voice cracking. He looked up at Emily, his eyes red and swollen. "Emily, I am so incredibly sorry." For what I said this summer. For Kathy. We were arrogant. We were stupid. Emily looked at him for a long moment, the firelight casting deep shadows across her weathered face. Apologies don't chop wood, Bill. And they don't generate heat. Save your energy. Your wife has a long way to go, and the storm isn't over. As if on cue, a massive gust of wind struck the earth above them. A low, concussive thud that vibrated through the floorboards. The blizzard was intensifying. For the next 24 hours, the dugout became an island suspended outside of time. Above them, the Pine Ridge anomaly raged with unprecedented fury, dumping an additional 3 feet of snow onto the already buried landscape. The wind shear tore the roofs off older barns in the valley and snapped power poles like matchsticks. Down in the bunker, time was measured only by the steady consumption of oak logs. Kathy's recovery was slow and terrifying. For the first 12 hours, she barely moved, her breathing shallow and ragged. Emily forced warm, sugary water past her lips every hour, maintaining a vigil over the younger woman while Bill slept the dead, exhausted sleep of the traumatized. When Kathy finally opened her eyes on the morning of the third day, the confusion was absolute. She stared up at the rough wooden ceiling, the smell of earth and smoke disorienting her. "Bill?" she rasped, her throat painfully dry. Bill, who had been sitting against the woodpile, scrambled to her side. "I'm here, Kath. I'm right here. You're safe." Kathy looked past him, her eyes locking onto Emily Miller, who was quietly sharpening a hatchet near the stove. The memories came flooding back: the freezing living room, the burst pipes, the agonizing death march through the whiteout. She remembered the sheer terror of her mind shutting down in the snow. "Emily," Kathy whispered, tears instantly welling in her eyes. We're in your cellar." "Dugout," Emily corrected mildly, setting the hatchet down. "And you're lucky your husband has a thick skull and a lot of adrenaline. If he had stopped digging for another 5 minutes, I would be burying you both in the spring." Kathy tried to sit up, but her muscles screamed in protest. She fell back against the makeshift cot, weeping softly. All her superficial armor, the Upper Ridge Homeowners Association, the country club dinners, the imported tennis clothes had been stripped away, leaving only a profoundly humbled, frightened woman. "Rest," Emily said, handing Bill another mug of broth to give to his wife. "The worst of the cold is out of your blood, but your body burned through its reserves trying to keep your heart beating. Eat. Sleep. We aren't going anywhere." As the day dragged on, a new, unforeseen danger began to manifest. Around 4 p.m., Emily noticed a shift in the air quality. The crisp, clean smell of burning oak was being replaced by a thin, acrid haze that stung the eyes. She looked at the cast-iron stove. The flames, usually a vibrant yellow and orange, were burning a sluggish, sickly blue, and smoke was beginning to leak from the seams of the iron door. "The draft is failing," Emily muttered, quickly standing up and moving to the 2 PVC ventilation pipes extending from the ceiling. She grabbed her rebar rod and shoved it up into the intake pipe. Instead of punching through the snow to the open air, the steel rod hit a solid, immovable block of ice about 3 feet up. The sheer volume of snow drifting over the cabin had compacted, and the slight ambient heat escaping from the exhaust vent had melted the surrounding snow, which had then rapidly refrozen, creating a massive ice dam that completely capped both the intake and exhaust pipes. The stove was choking, and without the exhaust vent, the bunker was rapidly filling with deadly carbon monoxide. "What's wrong?" Bill asked, coughing as the smoke began to thicken near the ceiling. "Ice dam over the vents," Emily said, her voice tight with real concern for the first time. She slammed the rebar against the blockage again, but it didn't even dent the ice. The snow was too deep. The pressure turned it to concrete. "We're losing our oxygen." Panic flared in Bill's chest. They had survived the freezing whiteout, only to be suffocated in a warm box. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the lingering pain in his frostbitten fingers. "Can we open the hatch?" Bill asked, coughing harder now. "If we open the hatch, the wind will suck every ounce of heat out of this room in 3 minutes, and 6 feet of snow will collapse down the stairs," Emily replied, rapidly damping down the stove to reduce the smoke output. "We have to clear the pipe from the inside." "Give me the rod," Bill said, stepping forward. Emily looked at him. He was pale, exhausted, and his hands were wrapped in bandages she had made from torn sheets. "You don't have the grip strength right now, Bill." "I have the shoulder strength," Bill insisted, his eyes watering from the smoke. "Emily, give me the rod. Tell me what to do." Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second before handing over the heavy steel rebar. "It's a straight shot up," she instructed, shining her heavy flashlight up the dark PVC pipe. "The ice block is about 2 feet thick. You can't just poke it, you have to shatter it like glass. Hit it dead center, over and over, as hard as you can." Bill positioned himself directly beneath the pipe. He gripped the cold steel rod, the friction agonizing against his blistered, recovering hands. He took a deep breath of the rapidly thinning smoky air, braced his legs, and drove the heavy steel rod upward with everything he had. Clang! The impact vibrated painfully down his arms, jarring his teeth. The ice didn't break. Dust and small shards of frozen water fell down the pipe, hitting his face. "Again!" Emily shouted. Bill gritted his teeth, channeling every ounce of fear, frustration, and desperation he had felt over the last 3 days into his shoulders. He drove the rod up again. And again. And again. He lost track of time. His muscles screamed. His lungs burned for clean oxygen, and the smoke in the dugout was becoming dangerously thick. Kathy was coughing violently on the cot, pulling the wool blanket over her face. Bill's vision began to spot with black dots the early warning signs of carbon monoxide poisoning. "Come on!" Bill roared, a primal sound that belonged to the mountain, not to a boardroom. He drove the rebar upward with a final, violent thrust, throwing his entire body weight behind the steel. There was a sharp, explosive crack, followed by a sound like a rushing waterfall. A massive cylinder of solid ice gave way, and instantly, a column of freezing, violently fresh Arctic air blasted down the PVC pipe, hitting Bill square in the chest and knocking him backward onto the dirt floor. The pressure differential violently sucked the smoke out of the exhaust vent. Within seconds, the sickly blue flames inside the stove roared back into a vibrant, brilliant yellow, consuming the oak with renewed ferocity. Bill lay on the dirt, gasping greedily at the freezing, clean air pouring down from the surface, tears of relief streaming down his soot-stained face. Emily walked over, offering a hand. She hauled him to his feet. "Good hit," she said quietly. Bill nodded, unable to speak, realizing for the first time in his life what it meant to actually earn his next breath. The fourth morning arrived not with a roar, but with a profound, terrifying stillness. The low-frequency vibration of the wind that had drummed against the heavy timbers of the dugout for 72 hours simply vanished. The sudden absence of sound was so absolute, it woke all three of them. Emily sat up in her armchair, looking at the small battery-operated clock on the shelf. It was 7 a.m. She walked to the air intake vent and listened. There was no whistling, no howling. "It's over," she announced softly. Bill and Kathy exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated disbelief. They had been buried alive for 3 days. Are we sure?" Kathy asked, her voice trembling. She was sitting up now, leaning heavily against the earthbag wall, looking pale but alive. Emily picked up her heavy wooden mallet and the flashlight. "Only one way to find out." "Bill, grab the shovel. We have a lot of digging to do." They climbed the wooden stairs slowly, their bodies stiff and protesting. Emily stood beneath the heavy steel hatch. She unlatched the deadbolt. "Ready?" she asked. Bill gripped the handle of the square-nosed spade. He nodded. Emily pushed against the steel plate. It didn't move. She hit it with the mallet once, twice, shattering the thin layer of ice that had formed around the seal. She pushed again, putting her back into it. The hatch groaned, lifting an inch, then 2. A blinding, impossible beam of pure, brilliant sunlight pierced the darkness of the stairwell, cutting through the dusty air like a laser. With a final heave, Emily threw the heavy steel door backward. It didn't open fully. It slammed into a solid wall of pure white snow that had drifted over the property. But the sky above was a staggering, violent shade of blue. Bill immediately went to work. Standing on the stairs, he used the spade to carve away the compacted snow, throwing it down into the empty space of the stairwell, slowly clearing a tunnel upward. It took 20 minutes of hard labor to carve a path through the 4-foot drift that had buried the entrance. When he finally breached the surface, he climbed out, pulling himself up onto the frozen crust of the snowpack. Emily followed, her heavy boots crunching on the ice. They stood together on the surface of a changed world. The San Juan Mountains were unrecognizable. The landscape had been smoothed and suffocated by millions of tons of snow. Pine trees that had stood 60 feet tall were snapped in half, their jagged trunks protruding from the white dunes like broken bones. The access road was entirely gone, buried beneath drifts that were, in some places, 10 feet high. But it was the view up the hill that truly stole their breath. The upper ridge, the crown jewel of Oak Ridge's elite, was a disaster zone. The modern, glass-fronted chalets looked like ruined fishbowls. Without heat, the heavy snow loads had proven too much for some of the flat, architectural roofs. 2 houses down, Richard Davies' expansive property had suffered a partial structural collapse, the steel I-beams groaning under the weight of the ice. Bill turned his gaze to his own home. The massive panes of triple-glazed glass were completely frosted over, opaque and dead. Massive icicles, some 6 feet long, hung from the eaves like jagged teeth. He knew without stepping foot inside that the interior was entirely destroyed. The burst pipes would have flooded the lower levels, expanding and shattering the hardwood, ruining the drywall, and destroying millions of dollars in finishing work. It was a frozen, uninhabitable tomb. He looked back down at the lot they were standing on. Emily Miller's old A-frame cabin was half buried, but the steep pitch of its 1970s roof had done exactly what it was designed to do: shed the massive snow load down to the sides, keeping the structure sound. And beneath their feet, completely invisible to the eye, was the masterpiece of earth and timber that had saved their lives. "It's gone," Bill whispered, staring at his mansion. "Everything is ruined. Wood warps. Pipes burst. Glass shatters," Emily said quietly, adjusting her sunglasses against the blinding glare of the snow. She wasn't gloating, she was simply stating the facts of the mountain. "But you're breathing, Bill. A lot of folks probably aren't this morning." A faint, rhythmic thumping echoed off the canyon walls in the distance. Bill turned his head, his heart leaping into his throat. Coming up the valley, a small black dot against the brilliant blue sky, was a National Guard search and rescue helicopter. "They're coming," Bill said, tears springing to his eyes for the 100th time. He turned to Emily, grasping her gloved hand in both of his. "Emily, I don't know how I can ever repay you. Whatever you need. Money, rebuilding this place, anything." Emily gently pulled her hand back, offering a small, tired smile. "I don't need your money, Bill. My house is fine. My wood is dry. But next summer, when the ground thaws out," she pointed to the massive, frozen block of his destroyed propane generator up on the hill, "you might want to think about buying a wheelbarrow." Bill Chambers looked at the woman, then at the smoking metal vent pipe protruding from the snowpack at his feet. He let out a breathless, exhausted laugh that quickly turned into a sob of pure gratitude. "Yeah," Bill nodded, wiping his eyes. "Yeah, I think I will." Down in the dugout, safe and warm, the fire continued to burn. When spring finally thawed the San Juan Mountains, Oak Ridge was forever changed. The Upper Ridge HOA spent millions repairing shattered glass, burst plumbing, and collapsed roofs, their illusion of invincibility washed away by the melting snow. Bill and Kathy Chambers never repaired their imported propane generator. Instead, as the ground softened in late May, Bill appeared at Emily Miller's property line, not with a condescending smirk, but with a pair of heavy leather work gloves and a forged steel spade. The town's social divide had been buried beneath 6 feet of snow, replaced by a profound, humbling respect for the unforgiving alpine environment. Emily's earth-sheltered dugout remained a quiet, subterranean fortress, a testament to the fact that true resilience cannot be purchased with smart technology. As the neighborhood rebuilt, they no longer laughed at the widow's dirt trench. They asked her to teach them how to dig.